Hey guys, so I am going to do some tutorials on Debian, or at least I'm going to start with Debian. And right now, today's tutorial is going to be about installation. Why installation? Well, I figured it would be better if you guys could see it from scratch as opposed to coming in the middle. So I wanted this to be as beginner friendly as possible, but it's still going to touch on advanced topics. So beginners, don't be afraid. I'll walk you through it pretty step by step. For everybody who is advanced, you will see the more advanced topics in later videos, hopefully. So to begin, first and foremost, I'm using VMware, but these steps should, in theory, translate pretty easily over to VirtualBox. And I might show you a VirtualBox installation at a later date. At the end, probably in video 2 of this series, I will show you how to overcome the desktop compositioning, the desktop effects, and all that stuff. So you'll be able to enable that, and I can even show you how to get things like the desktop cube and the wobbly windows and this and that. I'll get GNOME to not fall back to GNOME 2 like it does by default, and this and that on there. So if you follow this tutorial, you should be pretty good when you get done with it. If you're doing this on normal hardware, then you'll need to burn the ISO onto a disk or use a utility such as unetbootin, and I'll put a link to that, or at least the name of that, in the description, I guess. And yeah, use that to make a ISO disk. That's a little bit outside the scope of this video, though. So I guess I'm going to begin by going to New Virtual Machine. And we'll get the little tutorial, or the little wizard guy here. I'm just going to take typical. I'm going to point this at my Debian installation. So let's get this thing out of Windows here and into Debian, where we belong. There we go. Okay, so I have the KDE version, I have standalone version, I have the x64 version, whatever. I have lots of different versions of Debian on here, as you can see. I'm going to choose the default one, which is Debian 7.5 AMD64 cd1.iso. That is what you should download from debian.org. If you want, you can also grab the KDE version and follow this tutorial perfectly. I will do some stuff on the KDE later. The reason why I'm focusing on this one is not because I like GNOME better, but simply because that is stock default, as Debian intended Debian. So I'm going to show you how to set that up first, and then I'll show you the KDE. I'll probably resume with KDE at a later date. But yeah, for now we're going to stick to stock, which is unfortunate because I don't care for stock as much, but that's the way most people are going to be experiencing this, so we'll go with that for now. So yeah, we'll just choose open on our ISO, and it should detect it, and that's great. So we'll hit next. Tell it we want Linux Debian 64-bit. That should be predetermined. You're going to want to point this to your installation for where you want this thing to actually store your file for your virtual machines, and we're going to do this right here. That's VirtualBox. Let's go with V virtual machines. There we go. And yeah, we're just going to store this here, and we're going to call this Debian 7 64-bit GNOME, or GNOME, however you want to pronounce it. And then next, and we're going to go ahead and scale this down to 8 gigabytes, because it is absolutely pointless to give it more than that for a tutorial video. I personally prefer to store the virtual disk in a single file. I don't feel that storing them as multiple files is really necessary. The performance is better on a single file, plus in my opinion, it's easier to manage one single file than it is a whole bunch of little ones. The only reason a whole bunch of little ones would be advantageous is if you want to move it one file at a time with a USB drive. Personally, that would drive me crazy, and I'd rather just send one big file through the internet than move it one file at a time. Okay, so here we have basically the ability to customize your hardware, how you want to set it up. And the stock has these options. I'm sure you can read them. There are two things really to note here that you want to mess with. First of all is memory. And for my purposes, I'm going to go ahead and increase the amount of memory. I'm just going to do it up here with the numbers and do 1024. That is for for those of you who don't know, 1 gigabyte of space. And you just close it and verify here that it has changed to 1024 megabytes or 1 gigabyte of space. The other thing I want to point out is the network adapter. It is set to NAT, or Network Address Translation. Network Address Translation forces your network interface to work more like a common router in your household. Things on the NAT can talk to each other, so your VMs will be able to speak to one another. Things outside of the NAT will not be able to talk in. So they'll see one common IP address, but it will not actually allow things to communicate backwards. So if you're hosting a server, or if you're planning on hosting a server with your virtual machine, you're going to want to use bridged and not NAT for this purpose. Bridged is outside of the scope of this particular video. I will cover it in a different video, how to set up bridged network connections. For now, network address translation will suffice. That will get our device on the internet, which is what we want. We are not trying to host a server at the moment. We will, however, later host servers. Alright, so we're going to say finished. And this should, with all luck, if everything has gone smoothly, and I believe it has, bring up our Debian installer, and there it is. If you are using just a keyboard, if you do not have a mouse on the system, I recommend you choose install. If you have a mouse, Graphical Install is, well, it's prettier. That's about it. It's a little less intimidating, I think, because it's graphical. I don't know. Personally, I don't care. I use either or interchangeably, but for the sake of the new people, I'm going to use the graphical one just because it looks better, I guess. So I'm going to choose continue, because yes, I am an English speaker from the US. So here we go. And while I do know, bits and pieces of other languages, I don't know them well enough to set my system to them. So sorry for all you folks who are not of the English speaking nature, or if English is not your first language. But yeah, my English is probably more understandable to you than your native tongue, whatever that may be, I'm sure. Alright, so this thing is just going to set up some basic stuff, configure the network, blah blah blah, get all that good stuff configured and set up. Basically, it's fairly straightforward at this point. And most of this wizard really is very straightforward. It's really kind of pointless to even make a tutorial on this, in my opinion, just because it's so easy, but, it is what it is. So, at this point, you choose a host name for your system. Host name basically needs to be something that's descriptive. They give you, like a little description here of what things kind of are, so if you read that, it should pretty much tell you what to do. Anyhow, so descriptive name for this would probably be virtual Debian GNOME or GNOME, whatever you insist on pronouncing it like. Your domain name, if you're on a domain, use your domain name. If you're not on a domain, then you can use localhost, localhost.local, local.com, anything, doesn't really matter. Key is be consistent, I guess. Not on a domain, I don't suppose it really matters. Anyway, your root password, set your root password. That's basically, if you're new to Linux, that's the administrator password for the system. It's like the master password, essentially. At this point, you're going to give your full name. I'm just a setup test user, it's fine. And then you're going to give your test user or your user account its own password. I recommend you do not make this the same as your root password. That is insecure. For the purposes of this video, they are the same because this is a demonstration video, and this Linux box here will be deleted in the future, so it's no big deal for me. For the locale stuff and the clocks and all that, I'm just going to take all the default settings. You set them up as is to your situation. So wherever you are, make sure you set it up for that. Alright, at this point you can set up guided partitioning. Guided partitioning basically automates a lot of the stuff and keeps you from having to get your hands dirty in the manual stuff. So it'll just automatically partition your system the way that you want it. You can set it up to use the entire disk using local volume manager, or you can do encrypted. If you're new and you don't care about encryption, just use the guided partitioner to set that up. Now here you're going to want to set up, or you're going to want to take note of your SDA if you have more than one hard drive here. This will be SDA, SDB, SDC, depending on the hard drive you're installing on. Remember which one that is. That is very important. Later on, that's going to be an issue when you go to install the bootloader to set this thing up to boot. You're going to want to make sure you put your bootloader on the same drive as your Linux is installed on. This is especially important if you have Windows on a second partition somewhere else on your system. Or on a second hard drive, especially on a second hard drive. So at this point, yeah, just note which one it is. Now I'm going to go ahead and go back because I want to show you guys the manual way of doing this. And just choose your drive and then hit next. And then yeah, we want to tell it yes, we want to create a new empty partition table on the device. This should give us our device with our space set as free space. So if we click on this, we can then create a new partition. We want to set the partition up so that we have a little bit of room left over for our swap space. So if we do 8.1 gigabytes of space here, and we can set the primary partition, tell it we want it at the beginning, and we want this to be root. We want to set this with the no A time flag. The no A time flag basically means that your system by default will write every time that you open a file, move a file, whatever. It'll keep all that data about write times on it. Now if you're setting up a server, that data might be important to you, so you can do things like logging and tracking and blah blah blah, all that administrative stuff. But if you're just setting up a desktop system, and especially if you're using a solid state drive in your system, it may be wise or even important to you to use the no A time flag in order to stop those writes from happening. I'm not sure if defaults includes that yet or what, but personally I selected just to be safe and just to know that it's done. It does save you some performance in my opinion. Label your drive. This is whatever you want to label it. It's a good idea to label these things so that way when you go in to recover them, if your system ever crashes, you can do that. And then you want to mount it. Your mount point, if you set your mount point, you can choose the root. You can choose to mount it as home, temp, whatever one you want. If you were doing one partition all in one big file system, then you're going to want to just do the root. If you're doing multiple ones, if you want to set a home directory with its own specified partition, then you're going to want to set it there. If you have a secondary drive somewhere else on your system and you don't want to mount it now, you want to mount it later, that's okay, do that. Then that's okay. You can switch that up later. You can set another system drive to mount to home later if you want. If you are going to attempt to use an NTFS partition as your home directory, I highly advise against doing this. The NTFS file system, which is basically a Windows partition, does not adhere to the Linux, or does not understand the Linux permission system. So when you mount that as your home directory, you will be able to store files there. However, you will have a lot of permission issues with certain files. So if you're going to do that, I recommend setting up a subdirectory within your home directory. So home, username, and then storage, and then the NTFS file system will mount to storage and not to your user directory or to home. This way you can avoid those permission issues for the critical files, the configuration files that reside within your home directory. Leave the bootable flag off. You don't need that on. So at this point you can select done setting up the partition if you're happy with your configuration of this particular partition. One final note about this: when you're setting up your partitions, you can also do use as up here, and this is where you change your file system around. The best one to use for Linux, in my personal opinion, at least as are listed here, is ext4. And hit done and then continue when you're happy with it. And now we're going to configure the rest of this to be our swap. So create new partition, just leave the default there. choose logical for swap, and then do swap area for use as, and then that's it. That's really all you need to do. Do done setting up the partition and continue, and that sets it up as swap space. When you're happy with the way your drive is set, do finish partitioning and write changes to disk. I cannot stress enough, track what this is. SDA, SDB, SDC. Know which drive you're installing on. That's going to be very handy later. And it is these three letters: SDA, SDB, SDC. That should be SD if you have anything new enough to have a SCSI or a serial ATA drive. If you've got an IDE drive, it may be labeled HDA, HDD, or HDC, HDB, whatever. But most modern systems will label them with the SD scheme. But just note what it is. Okay, so if you're happy with the way your structure looks for your drive, then just hit yes, and then, or click on yes, and then hit continue. And now it's going to install the base system. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video so you're not bored. Okay, so at this point, if you've been following along, you'll have reached the Configure the Package Manager screen. This screen is basically about setting up your package manager, which you definitely want to do. But at this particular point, you're choosing whether or not you want to scan a second DVD or CD in. So Debian is distributed in set of CDs, I guess, or DVDs, depending on what you download. And in order to do the installation, you should have downloaded at least DVD or CD1. There is really no need to get the others. You don't need them. But if you do have them, or for some reason want them, specifically if you're installing on a system that's not going to be able to reach the internet, it may be wise to do that and then scan them in here. For most people, you're going to select no and choose continue. At this point, you're going to be asked to choose a network mirror, and you'll basically definitely want to do that if you're using a system that's connected to the internet. So you're going to click continue here, and you're going to set whatever your package manager mirror is closest to you. So you're going to want to choose your country. I'm just going to take the defaults. And you get a list kind of like this, and this list will be pretty vague about where it's coming from. If you happen to know one is near you, you can grab it. Really, I just normally take the default here personally. Okay, so this part is about setting up a proxy server, or connecting to a proxy server, or from behind a proxy. So if you own a proxy or have a proxy, you can choose to point to it in this manner here, following this little sort of I guess form here, and yeah, just type that in here. So http:// your username, your password at your host your port, and that should give you your proxy connectivity. If you're not using a proxy, which in this case I am not, you'll just click continue, leaving it blank. And at this point, it's going to start configuring the apt package manager. Apt is basically what you use to install software 95% of the time on 95 being an arbitrary percentage, but anyway, most of the time on a Linux system, you use your package manager to do your installations. You know, you can sideload if you want, which is basically install something that's not in your default repositories or in your package manager. So if you're going to compile from source code, or grab a binary from somewhere else and install it, or however, then you can do that. But generally speaking, most of the stuff you're going to get will be from your repositories, especially in Debian. Debian has a massive amount of software. It's ridiculous how much it has. So anyway, this is going to start doing the installation process of some of the standard software and just getting the system basically ready for selections and such. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pause it again and come back when it's done doing this, so you don't have to be bored watching a little loader bar. Okay, so this is popularity contest. Popularity contest is basically, well, I mean, you can read about it right here, so I'm not going to delve into it very much, but yeah, you can just read through this and figure out what it is. It's basically a package survey. Use your judgment, figure out what you want to do. There's no real harm in it, I don't think. But because this is a demonstration installation and isn't really for real use, I'm going to go ahead and select no here. And here you basically get your packages. This is basically like setting up a your default packages for your system. So if you're on a virtual machine, you're probably going to want to select desktop environment and standard system utilities. If you want to set up a server, do not check desktop environment, and you'll get basically a command prompt or a shell, essentially, terminal session only kind of interface. If you're on a laptop, you should definitely choose laptop. That'll give you the ability to, have power management and stuff like that for your laptop, so you can, not kill your battery as quickly. If you have a print server set up or you want to do SSH or this or that, you can choose that now. For this tutorial, I'm going to leave just the default Debian desktop environment and the standard system utilities checked. We will be working with an SSH server later on in the video, and I'll show you how to, well, not this video, but later on in the series. And I'll show you how to do a secure setup of it and all that later on. But for this tutorial, we're just going to click continue here. And at this point, it's going to do a big installation process, so I'm going to go ahead and speed the video up, and you should see that when we come back. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. So I lost my audio earlier, and I just want to basically redo the audio on this last part of the video. So if it's out of sync or weird, I apologize. My mic came unplugged and I didn't really realize it. So yeah, fun stuff that. Anyway, what I'm gonna do now is hopefully I can play this video at the same time and kind of run through it with you. So generally, what this is now is the Grub Bootloader install screen. And if you were paying attention before and you caught those 3-letter code for your hard drive, this is where that's going to matter. So if you're installing Grub onto a single hard drive in a single system and you only have Linux on it, you want to choose yes here. Now it's important to note that dual booting and all that is sort of outside of the scope of this video, but it's okay if you want to do that. Just know that you need to be a little bit wiser in order to understand kind of how to work that. Use your best judgment. Of course, when you install a hard drive, when you install an operating system from scratch again, you're obviously going to be taking some measure of risks. But anyway, that disclaimer aside, if you're just installing a single to a single disk, again, you want to just choose yes. If, however, you have multiple disks or multiple partitions to consider, especially if you have Windows on a second partition, you are probably going to want to choose no here, and you'll manually put this particular, or you'll manually put Grub on the drive you specify. You're going to have this blank that you can fill out. So you'll see I'm selecting and highlighting some information here for you on the screen. Those are sort of the default way you want to, the little form you want to type it in as. So it's a directory structure. So you're going to start with dev, and dev is your device's directory. It's a subdirectory in the root directory, so it's root/dev, and then slash and the device name. And in my case, it will be SDA, and this is where you needed to have figured out what yours was. Now, note that SDA2 will be the second partition on the drive. SDC5 is the first extended partition of the third hard drive, I believe it is. So just note what yours was, and hopefully it works out well for you. Just be sure what you're typing in here is correct.
That's very important. Installing this to the wrong thing could cause your system to not boot, and it could even corrupt or damage, your Windows partition or other partitions or other bootable media, bootable hard disks that you have on your system if you configure this line incorrectly. So be very careful here. Use your best judgment, and hopefully you've done it correctly. So at this point, it's running through the installer, and when it gets done with this, we should be ready to reboot into our fresh Linux environment. And so here we're just going to select Continue, and it should reboot our system. So here's the reboot process for you, and now you can see it booting up. This is your grub bootloader. You're going to want to choose your your actual kernel. If you have a Windows partition, you'd have seen it in that menu, and if you wanted to boot to it, you would select it from there and then boot to it. Okay, so here is your login menu for your new Linux system. You're going to choose your user ID, type your password that you entered in before, and you should get your desktop. As you can see, or VMware will fall back to GNOME 2, and that is because the video drivers are not currently working correctly. And it's going to take a little bit more than just installing the guest tools to get them there. Not too bad, but the secret is you're going to be compiling something. And I'll show you that in video number 2. And for those of you who don't like GNOME 3 and want GNOME 2, well, you have it now. Congratulations. So I guess that's it for today. I'll see you in the next video.